They tried to handcuff his voice with paper, 12 pages, carefully written by strangers, signed by no one, a script of surrender disguised as diplomacy. "Read this, President," they said. "This is how you survive. This is how you maintain partnerships." But Ibrahim, the young leader of Burkina Faso, was not sent to the United Nations to read someone else's words. He was sent to represent a people silenced for centuries, to speak the truth that many had been too afraid to voice. In a world where African leaders are often pressured to apologize for asserting their sovereignty, faced an extraordinary choice: bow to global powers or stand firmly for his nation as dignity. Calls came from Washington, Paris, Tel Aviv. Threats, promises, drafted apologies, waiting for his signature. Every Western diplomat expected compliance. Every headline assumed surrender. But S' decision would not be ordinary. It would not be safe. It would awaken a continent. He knew that a single speech, delivered with courage and clarity, could do more than confront the United Nations. It could redefine how Africa, Burkina Faso, and the world see dignity and power. Do you think a small African nation can truly stand up to the world and demand respect? Stay with this story, because what happened next shook not only the UN, but every corner of Africa, and every heart that believed in justice. 2 months before the United Nations appearance, President Ibrahim had already made waves with a speech that dared to speak truth to power. He criticized Israel and its allies for actions in Gaza, drawing parallels with the suffering of African nations like Mali, Congo, and Niger. The world responded not with understanding, but with pressure. A week later, the UN Secretary General's office sent a formal letter. It did not ask for clarification, it demanded a confession. From Paris, Washington, and Tel Aviv, calls came in. Offers were made, veiled threats followed. Development aid dangled like a carrot. Sanctions loomed like a sword. And then came the ultimate step: a drafted apology, pages meticulously written, instructing to soften his words, apologize for his tone, and reaffirm shared values. Whose values? He asked himself. Africa's values had never included silence in the face of genocide. At 2:00 a.m., a personal phone rang. Ambassador Richardson from the U.S. State Department arrived unannounced with 2 unidentified aides, carrying satellite images of Burkina Faso's gold mines, financial records of Chinese infrastructure deals, intelligence on Russian military advisors, and documents detailing Iranian pharmaceutical investments. Every action of Burkina Faso's independent diplomacy had been observed, yet was unmoved. He understood that these pressures were not mere persuasion, they were tests of sovereignty. He instructed his security team to leak false hints that he might comply, buying strategic advantage while preparing his own message across Africa and the world. Diplomatic sources began reporting that Burkina Faso's leader was reconsidering his approach. Western media speculated that compromise was imminent. But in Revolution Square, Ouagadougou, 50,000 citizens gathered to hear his true intentions. He told them plainly, "They think we will apologize. They think Africa is still a continent that begs for permission to speak." The crowd erupted. Young and old, men and women, children and elders, all understood that this was a moment of unprecedented dignity and defiance. The stakes were immense. The pressure global, but knew that to surrender was to betray centuries of struggle. And that was only the beginning. When Ibrahim stepped into the United Nations General Assembly, the air was thick with anticipation. Delegates from over 100 nations were present, many smirking, some indifferent, others quietly skeptical. They expected a young African leader to falter, to follow the carefully drafted apology, to bow in submission. What they did not expect was the confidence, clarity, and unflinching resolve of a man speaking not only for Burkina Faso, but for a continent long silenced. Did not hesitate. Adjusting the microphone, he began with a pointed question. "How many times have you apologized for what you have done to Africa?" The chamber shifted uncomfortably. Silence fell. Cameras zoomed in. Every word was measured, every pause deliberate. He reminded the assembly of colonial histories, of massacres in Algeria and the Congo, of Western interventions masquerading as peacekeeping. He contrasted these with Africa's centuries-long silence and struggle, highlighting the hypocrisy of condemning African leaders for speaking truthfully. He confronted the narrative of Western superiority head-on. You accuse me of inciting hatred because I spoke truth, but when the bombs fall on Gaza, you call it defense. When African children starve because of trade policies, you call it economics. When we rise, you panic. His words were not mere rhetoric, they were a mirror held up to the powers that be, exposing the stark contrast between claims of morality and the reality of exploitation. The response in the room was electric. Delegates shifted in their seats. Some rose, unsure whether to protest or retreat. The French delegate eventually walked out, visibly uncomfortable. Cameras captured every reaction, every moment of hesitation. Meanwhile, back in Burkina Faso, the scene was equally charged. In Ouagadougou's Revolution Square, tens of thousands of citizens' grandmothers, students, market women, and children felt the electricity of his courage. They had gathered not for spectacle, but to witness their leader reclaim dignity for their nation. The most poignant moment came when pulled out his phone and read a message from a 12-year-old girl in Ouagadougou. Mr. President, Mike teacher says you're going to America to speak for us. Please, don't let them make you small. We are proud to be African. The chamber fell silent. Here was the voice of the people, guiding the voice of the president, reminding the world that leadership is rooted in responsibility to those you represent. Delivered his own apology, but not the one the UN expected. I apologize that it took this long for an African leader to stand in this chamber and speak without fear. I apologize that my predecessors felt they had to choose between sovereignty and survival. I apologize that African children grew up believing they needed Western approval to dream big. Then he drew the line. He would not apologize for being African, for refusing subjugation, for defending dignity. The impact was immediate, powerful, and historic. Within 3 hours, the African Union convened an emergency session. 43 ambassadors drafted the New York Declaration, vowing that no African nation would accept conditional aid, apologize for sovereignty, or permit foreign powers to dictate domestic policy. Across the continent, citizens responded with grassroots action. In Nairobi, students organized Dignity to teach self-determination. In Lagos, market women refused to sell products linked to Israeli settlements. In Accra, musicians sampled speech and songs, while Cape Town artists painted murals celebrating Africa's unbroken chain of leadership from Nkrumah to Mandela II. This was a turning point. The UN speech was not just defiance, it was a blueprint for African agency. It sparked a wave of political and social mobilization, demonstrating that leadership is effective only when it reflects the voice and dignity of the people. The ripple effect was unprecedented. The world could no longer assume Africa would apologize, bow, or remain silent, had redefined what it means for an African nation to stand whole on the global stage. And yet, this was only the beginning. The aftermath of President Ibrahim's UN speech rippled far beyond the marble halls of New York. Across Africa, citizens and governments alike began rethinking their relationship with foreign powers. It was no longer abstract, it was tangible. Ordinary people saw that sovereignty and dignity could be defended without begging for approval. The psychological shift was immediate. Africans realized they did not need permission to take control of their destiny. In Nigeria, youth activists launched the Sovereignty Tour, a series of town halls aimed at educating citizens about foreign interference in politics. In South Africa, lawyers filed cases pushing for sanctions against Western countries complicit in arms sales to conflict zones. In Ghana, university students surrounded the offices of an American mining company, demanding transparency in profits and taxation. In Kenya, farmers collectively refused to sell their coffee to European exporters at historically low prices, insisting on fair value for their labor. Social media amplified every act of resistance. Videos went viral, with millions of views documenting citizens exercising autonomy and demanding accountability. In Burkina Faso, the transformation was equally profound. Tens of thousands gathered in Revolution Square, not for protests or concerts, but to volunteer in rebuilding schools, restoring irrigation channels, and launching tech labs funded by the diaspora. Citizens took responsibility for national development. Local initiatives replaced dependence on foreign aid, showing that self-sufficiency was possible when dignity guided action. Grandmothers, children, and youth alike participated, signaling a generational commitment to sovereignty and empowerment. Politically, stance forced governments to rethink international relations. African leaders who had long operated under the shadow of Western influence began asserting autonomy. Tanzania renegotiated mining contracts to ensure the majority of profits remained in country. Zambia limited copper exports to nations recognizing Palestinian sovereignty. Sahel demanded French military bases vacate within 90 days. Each decision, framed as economic sovereignty or diplomatic independence, signaled a continental refusal to be subjugated. The psychological impact extended globally. Indigenous communities in the Americas cited SUN speech and land rights campaigns. Aboriginal activists in Australia referenced it in sovereignty movements. Pacific Island nations invoked similar rhetoric to combat climate colonialism. One African leader's courage became a blueprint for worldwide self-determination. Yet the Western response was swift and punitive. The European Union froze $27 million in development funds. The IMF postponed debt relief reviews, and French media launched smear campaigns. American think tanks warned that Burkina Faso risked isolation unless diplomatic norms were followed, but reframed this narrative. What they called isolation, he called independence. The underlying message was clear: Africa would no longer apologize for asserting its rights or demanding respect. Within months, Burkina Faso achieved complete food security, relying entirely on local expertise and ancestral agricultural knowledge. Techniques dismissed as primitive by Western experts turned out to be perfectly suited to local soil and climate, doubling harvests and proving the efficacy of indigenous innovation. Across the continent, nations renegotiated resource extraction agreements, launched sovereign wealth funds, and prioritized inter-African trade, bypassing historical reliance on Western intermediaries. The civil and political awakening sparked by speech marked a turning point in modern African history. Citizens were not just inspired, they were mobilized, organized, and empowered to take ownership of their nations. Governments were compelled to align with the aspirations of their people, and Africa's position on the global stage shifted fundamentally. And yet, the world had only seen the first wave of change. From the vantage point of Western capitals, President Ibrahim's speech was more than a challenge, it was a revelation. American and European policymakers realized that Burkina Faso, long considered a minor player in international relations, had exposed the fragility of traditional leverage. For decades, foreign powers had relied on economic aid, diplomatic pressure, and media narratives to maintain influence across sub-Saharan Africa. S. refusal to apologize shattered this illusion. In Washington, internal memos circulated in panic. Analysts admitted that the Burkina Faso model, as it was quickly dubbed, represented a fundamental threat to the established order. If replicated continent-wide, traditional methods of influence could become obsolete within 5 years. Diplomats and intelligence agencies recognized that Africa was no longer a passive recipient of guidance. It was an assertive actor demanding respect. The United States, accustomed to a predictable balance of power, had to reconsider every engagement strategy. European capitals shared similar concerns. Paris fretted over the precedent set by S' uncompromising stance. Brussels debated whether freezing aid or adjusting trade agreements could restore control. Batach action risked further alienating citizens empowered by S' speech. Analysts from London to Berlin warned that the psychological impact of one African president asserting sovereignty could cascade across the continent, creating a network of leaders unafraid to challenge Western authority. Media coverage reflected the tension. Headlines oscillated between criticism and begrudging acknowledgement. In France, state-affiliated outlets labeled a radical or reckless, while independent European journalists noted the unprecedented engagement of African citizens in governance. In the United States, think tanks debated whether Burkina Faso, as example, could inspire reform across the continent or destabilize long-standing partnerships. Yet, the growing public awareness of his speech fueled a narrative Western institutions could not easily control. Africa had found its voice beyond formal institutions. Global civil society responded enthusiastically. Indigenous groups in the Americas, facing centuries of dispossession, cited S rhetoric and advocacy campaigns. Aboriginal activists in Australia framed their sovereignty demands using language inspired by Burkina Faso's defiance. Pacific Island nations, grappling with climate change and post-colonial legacies, began invoking similar principles of self-determination in international forums, had inadvertently created a ripple effect of empowerment that transcended Africa. Within the United Nations, delegates recalibrated their approach to African leaders. Diplomats who once assumed compliance now treated African nations with caution, recognizing the potential for collective assertiveness. This shift was more than strategic. It was psychological. For the first time in decades, the West confronted the reality that African voices could articulate law, history, and policy with precision and moral authority. The very notion that Africa could assert independence without disruption or chaos challenged long-held biases. In Burkina Faso, the international attention validated domestic reforms. Citizens saw their president not only resisting external pressure, but also strategically advancing national interests. Chinese engineers modernized telecommunications, Russian experts transformed agriculture, and Iranian pharmaceutical firms improved healthcare infrastructure, all while the nation retained sovereignty over this combination of resistance and competence startled the world. Africa was no longer a passive participant. It was a teacher, a model, and a symbol. American observers, in particular, noted the implications for U.S. foreign policy. S insistence on dignity over convenience illustrated that soft power alone would not guarantee influence. Engaging with African nations now required respect for autonomy, transparency, and partnership rather than dependency. Policy analysts realized that the days of scripted diplomacy, unilateral decision-making, and assumed compliance were ending. The United States and its allies would need a new framework, one acknowledging Africa as an equal, not a subordinate. The broader global reaction was equally remarkable. Across the Caribbean, nations began re-evaluating structural adjustment programs, inspired by Stand. Haiti, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago all took steps toward economic and political autonomy. Even cultural influence shifted. Artists, students, and activists worldwide referenced S words as a call to claim agency and reject imposed limitations. His speech was no longer a national event. It was a global movement, advocating dignity, independence, and In sum, SUN's speech demonstrated that leadership grounded in principle can alter perceptions, reshape policies, and inspire collective action across continents. For the United States and the West, it was a wake-up call. Africa was no longer an audience for moral lectures or controlled aid. For the world, it was a lesson. Sovereignty, dignity, and courage resonate far beyond borders. Burkina Faso, under S. Bold vision, had become the epicenter of a new era in global leadership, one where speaking truth is both power and responsibility. Just when the world assumed Burkina Faso would face isolation and pressure, something unexpected happened. The ripple effect of President Ibrahim Traoré's speech transformed the balance of power in Africa. Nations that had quietly admired his courage began taking bold steps, inspired by his example. In Tanzania, mining contracts were renegotiated so that the majority of profits stayed local. In Zambia, copper exports were restricted to countries recognizing Palestinian sovereignty. In Senegal, French military bases received 90-day eviction notices. These were not acts of rebellion. For rebellion's sake, they were calculated moves asserting sovereignty. What Western powers failed to realize was that defiance was contagious. Young leaders, activists, and ordinary citizens across the continent began demanding accountability, transparency, and autonomy. A culture of dignity replaced decades of dependence. It was a shift that no amount of diplomacy, sanctions, or media campaigns could reverse. By refusing to apologize, had inadvertently sparked a continental awakening, turning Burkina Faso from a perceived minor player into a symbol of African assertiveness. The global stage watched in disbelief. As S's influence grew, Caribbean nations, inspired by his stance, began withdrawing from conditional aid programs. Indigenous communities worldwide cited his speech in land rights and sovereignty movements. The UN, the United States, and European powers realized that this was no longer about Burkina Faso. Alone it was a model for collective empowerment. Himself remained grounded in purpose. He understood that leadership is not measured by compliance, but by the courage to redefine what is possible. By refusing to bow, he became more than a president. He became a symbol of hope and resilience. Citizens who had long been silenced saw their dignity reflected in his actions. Governments that had underestimated Africa's capacity for autonomy were forced to recalibrate. The twist was clear. What was intended to isolate him only amplified his influence, turning a single speech into a movement that redefined Africa's place in the world. By the time President Ibrahim returned to Ouagadougou, the impact of his UN speech was undeniable. Streets filled not with protests, but with people choosing action over despair, volunteering to rebuild schools, restore irrigation channels, and launch technology labs funded by the diaspora. Burkina Faso had achieved complete food security, relying solely on local knowledge and ingenuity. The crops thrived, the communities flourished, and the nation proved that dignity and competence could thrive without foreign validation. S. refusal to apologize was more than defiance. It was a declaration. Africa would no longer negotiate its sovereignty for comfort. Every handshake, every policy shift, every citizen-led initiative reflected a continent reclaiming its voice. From Nairobi to Lagos, Cape Town to Harlem, people were inspired not just by his words, but by the possibility he unveiled that self-determination and excellence are choices, not privileges. As famously said, we did not ask for freedom, we stood up to take it. If the spirit of Ibrahim moves you, share this story. Subscribe to witness the rise of an Africa that no longer bows. Stand with us, honor dignity over comfort, and remember, the next time one of us is silenced, millions will speak in unison. No apology, no surrender. Africa, Risen.